There are machines the United States military built that shouldn't exist, not because they're secret, because the engineering required to make them work defied what seemed physically possible at the time they were created. We're talking about machines that change the outcome of wars, machines that enemy commanders specifically designed their entire defense strategies around. Machines so well built that some of them have been in continuous service for over 50 years, and the military still can't figure out what to replace them with. This is the story of the most consequential American military machines ever built, and what they actually did on the ground when it counted. The first thing you need to understand is what separates a great military machine from the kind that rewrites history. Plenty of weapons work, plenty of tanks roll, plenty of aircraft fly. The machines on this list didn't just function, they changed the way wars were fought, sometimes overnight. Some of them were ugly, some of them were old before their time. One of them was nearly canceled 3 separate times before it finally proved the critics wrong in the most dramatic way possible. But all of them shared one thing. When American soldiers on the ground were in the worst situations imaginable, these were the machines they called for. We're going to start not with the most famous, but with the one that had the most direct impact on the most American lives, because that's where the story earns its weight. The M1 Abrams entered service in 1980, and the Army immediately had a problem with it. Not because it didn't work, because it worked almost too well, and the logistics of keeping it running were unlike anything the military had dealt with before. The Abrams runs on a Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine engine. That engine can run on jet fuel, diesel, kerosene, or gasoline. The Army calls it multi-fuel capable. Mechanics who've worked on them for years call it the engine that burns everything. The turbine produces 1,500 horsepower and can accelerate a 68-ton vehicle to 45 miles per hour on flat ground. The problem is that it burns through fuel at a rate that still surprises people who've never been around one. At full speed, the Abrams consumes roughly 2 gallons of fuel per mile. Sitting still with the engine idling, it burns 10 gallons per hour. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, keeping Abrams units supplied became one of the most complex logistical operations in the history of American armored warfare. But that fuel cost turned out to be worth every drop. Iraqi armored units had Soviet-built T-72 tanks, which were considered competitive against Western armor at the time. They were well armored, well armed, and had been battle-tested in the Iran-Iraq War. Iraqi commanders believed they could hold their ground against American armor in direct engagements. What happened instead became one of the most studied engagements in modern military history. In a battle at a place called 73 Easting in February 1991, a force of American M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles engaged a much larger Iraqi armored force. The engagement lasted approximately 23 minutes. The Iraqis lost nearly 200 vehicles. The Americans lost none. Part of that was crew training. Part of it was tactics. But a significant part was the Abrams' depleted uranium armor, which was impenetrable to anything the Iraqis could throw at it, combined with a fire control system that could identify and engage targets faster than opposing crews could even locate the Americans. The tank continued proving itself in 2003 and has been upgraded continuously since. The M1A2 SEPV3 variant carries thermal imaging, active protection systems, and digital communications that would be unrecognizable to the crews who first took it to the Gulf in 1990, and the Army is still trying to figure out whether anything built today could actually replace it. So far, nothing has. But the Abrams fights on terms it chooses. It can maneuver, hold ground, and establish fire superiority. There are situations in combat where none of that matters, where soldiers are already in contact, already taking fire, and what they need isn't a tank a mile away. They need something overhead that can see exactly what's happening and respond in seconds. That's where the story of the A-10 Thunderbolt II begins, and it's one of the stranger stories in American aviation history. The A-10 was designed in the early 1970s for one specific mission: close air support, killing tanks and protecting ground troops in direct combat. Every decision in the aircraft's design came from that single requirement. It was so specialized, so purpose-built, that the Air Force spent decades trying to retire it in favor of faster, more versatile jets, and every time they tried, the Army and Marine Corps objected loudly enough to stop it. The reason is the GAU 8/A Avenger cannon mounted in the nose. It fires 30mm depleted uranium rounds at up to 3,900 rounds per minute. The cannon is so large and so heavy that the aircraft was essentially built around it. The gun sits slightly off-center in the fuselage because putting it in the exact center would have required relocating the nose gear. The entire front of the aircraft is basically a gun mount with wings attached, but the cannon is only part of what makes the A-10 irreplaceable to ground forces. The airframe is built to absorb damage that would destroy any other aircraft. The cockpit is surrounded by a titanium bathtub capable of withstanding 23mm cannon fire. The flight controls have redundant hydraulic systems, and if both fail entirely, the A-10 can still be controlled using manual reversion, a backup system most modern aircraft simply don't have. The fuel tanks are self-sealing. The engines are positioned high on the rear fuselage so that ground fire is less likely to hit them, and engine debris from one won't damage the other. A-10s have landed safely with one engine, a missing tail, large sections of wing gone, and hydraulic systems completely shot out. There are combat damage assessments from Iraq and Afghanistan that read like lists of things that should have killed the aircraft and didn't. More importantly, when a ground unit calls for close air support from an A-10, the response time is fast and the results are visible immediately. Ground commanders can see the aircraft working. They can communicate directly with the pilot. For a unit in contact, pinned down and taking casualties, that visibility matters as much as the firepower itself. If you want to go deep on how these machines operate across different environments and conflicts, we cover stories exactly like this every week. Subscribe if that's the kind of content you're after. The A-10 has been in continuous service since 1977. The Air Force announced plans to retire it in 2022, and then reversed course again when combat experience in Ukraine demonstrated that low-altitude, heavily armored close air support aircraft are still needed in ways that faster jets can't replicate. The A-10 will likely outlive several of the aircraft that were supposed to replace it. Understanding the A-10 also means understanding something about how the military thinks about specialization versus versatility. For most of its existence, the argument against it was that modern faster jets could do everything the A-10 does, plus more. The argument for it was simpler. Nothing else does what the A-10 does as well as the A-10 does it. That argument has won every time. The same tension played out differently with the Bradley fighting vehicle, and the resolution there was more complicated. The Bradley entered service in 1981 as a vehicle that was hard to categorize. It wasn't a tank. It wasn't a troop transport. It was something in between that critics said tried to do two things and did neither well. The original design called for a vehicle that could transport infantry into combat, provide fire support with its 25mm chain gun and anti-tank missiles, and survive in environments where Soviet armor was present. The Army's critics said the Bradley was too lightly armored to protect infantry against serious threats, but too heavy and too complex to be an efficient troop carrier. A Senate subcommittee in 1980 recommended against buying it. Defense analyst Pierre Sprey, who helped design the A-10, called it a death trap. What happened in Desert Storm complicated that argument significantly. Bradley fighting vehicles destroyed more Iraqi armored vehicles during the Gulf War than M1 Abrams tanks did. Not because the Bradley is a better tank killer, but because there were more situations where Bradleys were the first on the scene. The 25mm chain gun, firing at high angles, was effective against the lighter tops of Iraqi armored vehicles in ways that direct tank engagements weren't. The Bradley's real contribution became clearer over the following 2 decades of urban warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. The vehicle's ability to carry infantry while providing immediate fire support changed how small unit tactics worked in cities. Units could dismount, clear buildings, and remount under the protective fire of the Bradley's weapon systems. That combination of mobility, firepower, and infantry capacity was exactly what counterinsurgency warfare required. The Army is currently transitioning to the M2A4 variant with significant upgrades to armor, sensors, and weapons. But the core concept, a vehicle that bridges the gap between armor and infantry, has proven durable enough that the Bradley's replacement, the XM30, is based on the same fundamental design philosophy. There is one machine in this conversation that sits outside every category. The UH-60 Blackhawk entered service in 1979 to replace the UH-1 Huey, which had defined American military aviation in Vietnam. Replacing the Huey was a significant task. The Huey was beloved by the soldiers who flew and rode in it, and it had served in more combat roles in more environments than any helicopter in American history. The Blackhawk was better in almost every measurable way, and it proved it quickly. The aircraft can carry 11 combat-loaded troops, or about 2,600 pounds of cargo, on an external sling. It flies at 183 miles per hour and operates in temperatures from extreme cold to desert heat. Medevac variants have carried wounded soldiers from remote mountain locations in Afghanistan that no other helicopter could reach. To the soldiers who have ridden in them across 50 years of American military operations, the aircraft has a specific meaning. It's the machine that shows up. Insertions into hostile territory in the dark, combat search and rescue when pilots went down, medical evacuation when ground vehicles couldn't reach the wounded. The Blackhawk has flown in Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of smaller operations that never made the news. The events of October 3rd and 4th, 1993 in Mogadishu, Somalia, are known widely enough that rehashing them here would do them a disservice. What's worth noting is what those 2 days demonstrated about the aircraft. 2 Blackhawks were shot down by rocket-propelled grenades over a densely hostile city. The response to those downed aircraft, the decision by American soldiers to hold their positions and protect the crew members, drove the entire sequence of events that followed. The Blackhawk didn't fail. The cost of protecting it defined what came after. The aircraft was upgraded to the UH-60M variant in the 2000s with new rotor blades, improved engines, and digital cockpit systems. It is currently being supplemented in some roles by the Sikorsky Boeing SB-1 Defiant as part of the Army's future long-range assault aircraft program. But the Blackhawk will remain in service well into the 2030s and likely longer. There is a final machine worth discussing, and it occupies a different place in this conversation. Not because it's the most recent or the most heavily armed, because it represents a specific promise the military made to ground forces decades ago and has kept every single time it was needed. The M2.50 caliber machine gun has been in service with the United States military since 1933. 90 years. The design was finalized by John Browning in 1918, refined and adopted in 1933, and has been in continuous production ever since. It is mounted on aircraft, ships, vehicles, and fixed positions. It fires a round that can penetrate light armor at 500 meters. The sustained fire rate sits around 450 to 600 rounds per minute. The effective range against area targets exceeds 1,800 meters. What the .50 caliber demonstrates is something the more technologically complex machines sometimes obscure. Reliability matters more than sophistication when lives depend on it. Soldiers have fired the M2 in temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit and above 130 degrees. They've fired it through rain, sand, mud, and salt water. The design is old enough that rebuilding or repairing it in the field is something any trained armorer can do without specialized tools or computerized diagnostic systems. The weapon has outlasted every piece of equipment it was originally designed to support. The aircraft it was mounted on in 1933 are gone. The vehicles from that era are museum pieces. The .50 caliber is still on the line. Taken together, these machines tell a story about what American military engineering has historically prioritized: lethality in defined roles, survivability under extreme conditions, adaptability across decades of changing conflicts, and a willingness to keep using something that works rather than replace it with something theoretically better. There are soldiers who have deployed with the Abrams, with the A-10 overhead, with Bradleys on their flanks, and Blackhawks inbound. They know what that combination means. They know because at some point in a very bad situation, each one of those machines was the reason the day ended the way it did. That's what makes them the most consequential American military machines ever built. Not the specifications, what happened when it mattered. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet.